Hi, Meera. I just went ahead and broadcast.
Sorry, go ahead.
I just went ahead. We're live now, so folks will be joining us.
Cool.
I'll wait until 9 o'clock to get things kicked off.
So when my computer just went into sleep mode, did you get a blank screen or a black screen?
I did not. I see your slide up.
Okay, good.
Mm-hmm.
That means it's just these monitors themselves. It doesn't actually broadcast. Whatever is running in the background, it's still running.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think we'll give people a few minutes here to get logged in.
Sounds good. So can they hear us talking right now when they log in, or you have to go live?
Yes.
Okay.
For those of you who are logged in already, we're going to wait just a couple minutes to give folks time to connect. We have about 30 people pre-registered for the webinar, and I see there's about 6 who are connected. So I just want to give folks a little more time, and we will get things started. Yes, for those of you who have logged in already, if you could look along your toolbar for Zoom, there's a Q&A box. If you wouldn't mind opening that up, we don't use the chat feature in Zoom webinars, but we're going to use the Q&A. So go ahead and write a little blurb about who you are and where you're calling in from, while we give other folks just a little bit more time to connect. I'm at home with my 2.5-month-old daughter right now, so if you hear cooing sounds in the background, that's Cora participating in our webinar. I will have my microphone on mute for most of this. All right, looks like we have folks from Anchorage, California, but actually northern Wisconsin. Welcome. Portland, Maine. Great. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and do my introduction here for Meera. Well, good morning. Welcome to the 3rd of 5 webinars hosted by ACEP this summer and fall. My name is Carolyn Leffler. I'm a program coordinator for the Alaska Center for Energy and Power here at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. If you missed the first 2 webinars from Karen Peterson of the Biomass Coordinator down in Southeast, or Matt Bergen of KEA in Kotzebue, you can find recordings in our newsletter, ACEP This Week. And if you haven't signed up for our newsletter, you can do so by going to ACEP, that's acep.uaf.edu, and scrolling all the way to the bottom of the page. If you're interested in learning more about the work ACEP does around the state, be sure to check out our YouTube channel. Amanda Bird has put together some wonderful videos about community energy projects here in Alaska. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. Like I said, that Q&A box is at the bottom of the screen there. So if you have questions during Meera's presentation, go ahead and enter them there. I will be monitoring the Q&A box, so hopefully we can get things answered in real time. Otherwise, there'll be lots of time for discussion at the end of the presentation. Also, when you close out of the webinar, Zoom is going to automatically open a survey in your browser. If you could take a moment to fill that survey out, let us know how we're doing, how the sound quality was, and what types of topics you would like to see in future webinars. That would be great. We have 2 more webinars coming up after this, so keep an eye out for one from Chris Rhodes at REAP and Gwen Holdman from here at ACEP. Without further ado, I'm very excited to welcome Meera Kohler of ABEC to our webinar stage today, and looking forward to the discussion. Meera, it's all you.
Thank you, Carolyn. I would love to hear Cora cooing in the background, but maybe you don't want that to happen. Anyway, first, a shameless plug about me. I have been in Alaska since 1976, so 43 years now. I come originally from New Delhi, India, and I have my degrees from the University of Delhi, and my career in the electric utility industry began in Cordova in 1979. So right now I'm in my 41st year of doing this. Lordy, lordy. Anyway, I left Cordova in 1990. I was at that time the manager of administration and finance, and I was hired to be the general manager of Naknek Electric Association, which is, as most of you know, about 300 miles southwest of Anchorage. I was lured back to Anchorage by the mayor of Anchorage after their long-term general manager, Tom Starr, retired. And so I managed municipal light and power for 2.5 years, from 97 to 2000. And then I got lured back into the industry I love the best, which is the rural electric cooperative industry. And I came to work here at ABEC as the president and CEO. So I've been here since 2000. And you see that very happy look on my face. That's because I had a dozen Simpson Bay oysters all to myself. And that results in a very happy face. So what is a cooperative? Now, many of you are familiar with what a cooperative is, but the rural electric cooperative model is actually one that is repeated about 900 times across the country. And actually, most Alaskans that are on electric service get their electricity from a cooperative. So we're a not-for-profit industry. We are actually owned by our members. And the way that happens is that every year when we have what would be called a profit in the for-profit industry, we actually call them margins. And those margins are allocated back to everybody that bought electricity from us. And so it's more or less pro rata. If we made $1 million profit, then your share of that $1 million is essentially your gross revenue to ABEC divided by the total gross revenue that ABEC received, and that is allocated to you. And then after typically many years, 15 to 20 years of using those margins as our equity investment in plant, those margins are then retired back to the consumer if the board feels that we are in adequate fiscal shape that we can afford to give that money back. So over the years, ABEC has accrued about a total of about $48 million in margins. And of that $48 million, more than half has been given back to the members. So we've actually enriched the economy by about $25 million in the last 15, 20 years. So we're governed by a member-elected board of directors. In our case, that's 7 board members. They come from all of our villages. They are all elected at large by the membership every year. every year, but not all of them are elected every year because their terms are staggered. They serve 3-year terms. 2 are elected 1 year, 2 the next year, and then 3 the final year. So in Alaska, cooperatives may or may not be economically regulated by a public utility commission, and that's determined by the members themselves. In AVEC's case, we are not economically regulated because about 20 years ago, the membership voted to self-regulate. So the board of directors serves the purpose of what the Public Utility Commission would serve with a regulated utility. So the board's job is the lofty ones. It's to hire the manager, to adopt budgets and work plans, and basically set general policy for the co-op. The CEO that they hire, which is me, essentially executes their budgets and work plans, and all the operations of the cooperative lie under the manager. So AVEC is a unique cooperative in the country because we are probably the only one that serves communities that are actually not geographically connected to each other. They are scattered all over the state. Most of them are not connected to each other, although we've been working pretty hard on fixing that in the last few years and have actually connected about 8 communities to other communities by building what we call tie lines. In the lower 48, they would be called transmission lines, but they're not transmission lines because of the voltage. They are relatively low voltage. They're typically 12.5 kV or 25 kV. So we call them tie lines as opposed to transmission lines. So in addition to serving many non-contiguous communities, our communities actually are unique because they have different cultures and languages in many of those communities. I think our communities speak something like 9 different languages, and they are unique languages. So they are races of Eskimo Indians and Native Alaskans that are unique depending upon the geography of where they are. But all of our communities essentially are sharing resources, so that is a pretty cool feature, in my opinion. So to talk a little bit more about AVEC specifically, we were incorporated in 1967. And how that came to be was that back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, only urban Alaska got energy, electric utilities. And communities like Nome, for example, where there was mining activity, there was gold activity, Cordova, where they had the Kennecott copper mine. So communities that had a bustling economy had received electricity back in the early 1900s. But for other parts of Alaska, including the valley and most of Anchorage, there was no electric utility to serve them. So the first electric co-op in the state was actually Matanuska Electric, and that was a function of the pioneers coming to Alaska and deciding that they needed electricity. And because they had experience from the lower 48, they set up a co-op. And MEA actually has been one of the supporters of rural electrification, and in fact played a pretty key role in the formation of AVEC. So back in 1967, the governor of Alaska at that time was Frank Murkowski. That was before he left Alaska to serve as Secretary of the Interior. And he was approached by prominent rural Alaskans to essentially plead their case for electrification because their villages did not have central station electric service. So Governor Murkowski formed a task force, and that task force essentially researched options to bring electricity to Alaska, and they decided that the most probable course of success was to establish a cooperative. And I think that MEA, Matanuska Electric, helped in that effort. But so they approached the Rural Electrification Administration, which is a division under USDA that was actually established in 1935 as part of the New Deal. So they approached them, and REA looked at the concept and went, oh my God, that can never work. And so, of course, we set to prove them wrong. And we were successful in winning a $5 million loan from them to start building electric service to rural Alaska. And the task force, which was 7 individuals appointed by the governor, became the first board, and they incorporated AVEC, and our first 3 villages were energized in 1968, in the winter of 1968. And that became the start of an interesting story, which is AVEC. So now, today, we serve 58 Alaska communities. We are scattered across the state. We serve 8 communities in Northwest Alaska, so around the Kotzebue area, most of the communities in the Bering Strait area, which is around the Nome area, more than half of the communities in the Waikay or Yukon-Kuskokwim region, 3 or 4 communities in Bristol Bay, and we even have a community in Southeast. Yakutat is one of Alaska's AVEC's communities. And actually, in the very early days, in the first couple of years that AVEC was formed, we actually built an electric utility to serve the community of Angoon down in Southeast Alaska. And it was so successful, and the local folks around that area was so enthralled at the concept that they had us work with them to create their own regional electrical authority, which they did, again, in the late 60s, early 70s. And we actually gave Angoon to them as the core of their service area. And that's how Tlingit Haida Regional Electrical Authority was formed, which is now known as Inside Passage Electric Cooperative. It's based in Juneau, and it serves 5 communities down there. So our 58 communities serve about 32,000 population of Alaska, so that's almost 45% of the rural Alaska population. We have about 185 full-time and part-time employees. About 90 of them are full-time, based out of Anchorage, Bethel, or Yakutat, and the rest are all part-time power plant operators out in the villages. So each village that we serve typically has 1 or 2, in rare cases 3 power plant operators that trade duties off and on in order for them to continue to live their subsistence lifestyle. It works out pretty well. So we have about 11,400 services, so that means meters out in the communities. We operate 48 power plants. So what that tells you is that we have 10 communities that are connected to other communities where there is a primary generator. In most of the communities where we don't have primary generation and we just have a distribution line to serve them, we typically will have a standby generator in that community, so that if something were to go awry, either in the primary generation community or on the tie line, then there's the capability to switch to local power. And that's worked out pretty good. So we burn about 8.5 million gallons of diesel a year, and you can see our kilowatt hour sales are about 118 million. And we have 36 wind turbines that serve 20 villages through these tie lines. And I'll tell you a little bit more about our wind generation a little later in this presentation. We have 2 small solar PV projects. For the most part, they have not been large producers, but what's happening up in the Northwest region, we are pretty excited about potentially more solar as it becomes more affordable in the system. And we also are very unique in that we own 2 tug and barge sets. We had those built back in 2010, 2011, and we did so we could inject some competition in the Western Alaska fuel delivery market because there was none. There were 2 significant players, and then one player bought out the second player, and we went, hey, wait a minute, what about competition? How are we going to get affordable, reliable fuel in our communities? And so our board decided to move forward and to actually invest in these tugs and barges, and I'll give you a little picture of them here momentarily. And there you see it in the background. That is one of our tug and barge sets, and as you can see, it's in a community where the kids are enjoying a wonderful muddy day. And it's nice to see that one of them is wearing a life vest. The water is not terribly deep, but nonetheless, that puddle could gobble you up if you were not too careful. So I thought I should pause for a moment, see if any questions have cropped up, get a feel for how things are going out there in the webinar universe. Okay, nothing so far. So what you see here is a map of where all of our villages are. Now, I don't know, can you see my cursor moving around on my screen, or is it just me?
We can see your cursor.
Oh, nice. I wasn't sure if that would work or not. But I just wanted to point out that over here in the southeast corner, there's Yakutat. We have a community on Kodiak Island. It's Old Harbor right here. And then you can see this is Dillingham. That's not one of our communities, but these are New Stuyahok, Ekwok, and Togiak are our 3 Bristol Bay communities. And we're in the process of moving forward to pick up the community of Twin Hills, which is just 2 or 3 miles away from Togiak. So this group of villages that you see over here, of course, is the YK area. Oh, and I do need to tell you that we do have one village right up here next to Fairbanks. It's about 100 miles from Fairbanks by the name of Minto, and it's actually on the road system. It is the only one of our villages that you can get to by road, and so we actually have fuel trucked there from Fairbanks during the year. So we have year-round delivery of fuel over here. This Minto and Old Harbor are the only communities that are ice-free. Well, they're capable of being reached during the winter. Minto is not ice-free, but the road operates all winter long. All of the rest of our communities are barge delivery. So during the summer, when we have open water in the rivers for a short time, about 4 or 5 months of the year, we take fuel up the rivers to those communities. And our 2 barges that we own deliver about 80% of our fuel that's used in the villages. So that's sort of a bird's eye view of where our communities are. And of course, for our lower 48 members and viewers, I like to show what Alaska looks like when it's superimposed across the United States. Gives you an idea of the distances and perspective. And if there are any Texans in the audience, I always delight in saying that if Alaska were to be carved in 2, Texas would be the 3rd largest state. So that's just my little gift for Texas. So we do have challenges, I can tell you that, despite having been in service for more than 50 years, our costs of power are extremely high because, as you know, we have 48 power plants out there, and the vast majority of them serve less than 200 meters or somewhere around 200 meters. So the cost of operating those individual power plants and distribution systems results in non-fuel costs of about 25 cents a kilowatt hour. So when you add the cost of fuel to that, our average rate is about 56 cents a kilowatt hour, which would make most lower 48 audiences gasp in horror because, you know, specifically the Pacific Northwest, for example, the delivered cost of electricity to a homeowner is typically 3 or 4 cents a kilowatt hour. It's a number we can't even conceive of. It's just beyond grasp of any kind. Because the cost of energy is so high in rural Alaska, we do have a state program called Power Cost Equalization, and I will touch upon that a couple slides later. And I do want to point out that where you have higher population density, such as in Bethel, which is our largest community of 6,300, non-fuel costs are a lot lower because you're delivering 40 million of our 118 million kilowatt hours is delivered in Bethel with a single power plant and with a core employee population of 16. So as a result, the cost of the non-fuel cost in Bethel is much lower than in other parts of our communities. But the cost of fuel actually is higher. And the reason it's higher is because we don't own a tank farm there, and we buy our fuel from the local wholesaler. And so we pay that wholesaler for what it would otherwise cost us to operate our own tank farm. So as a result, the cost of fuel is higher in Bethel. Just to give you a perspective of what has happened, what our cost per kilowatt hour is, this is a little outdated. what I have in here is 2016 on the far right end, but it's an appropriate perspective for where we are today. It's not much different today, so I didn't bother trying to find my most recent slide. It was somewhere in my mess of paperwork on my computer. But the bright pink component is the fuel component. And if you go back in time to where the beginning of this map is, that's 1996, which is really not that long ago. That's 22 years ago. But you will see back in 1996, the cost of fuel as a component of the cost of electricity was just over 10 cents a kilowatt hour. Today, it is about 30 cents a kilowatt hour. And you also see the other various components. And what this tells you is that depending upon how much electricity you're producing and selling, your costs vary significantly. So our costs have all gotten compressed as you look at the right end of it. And a lot of that occurred in 2014 when we took over Bethel. And you can actually see that on this chart, where in 2014, our non-fuel cost per kilowatt hour started to compress pretty heavily because we were able to get those benefits spread out over more kilowatt hours. So this is just to give you a perspective of the various components of our non-fuel costs. So in addition to our high cost of power, these are some of the reasons why our communities are constrained. For the most part, the average village population that we serve is about 400. But I will tell you that we have probably about 10 communities where the population hovers between 75 and 120. So those are really small communities. They're not interconnected, so you have replicated assets in every community. In addition to replicated assets, you have to have, for example, power plant operators in every village. And so because so few kilowatt hours are sold, you wind up with those high costs per kilowatt hour. If you take the average village of 400, we sell a total of 1,300 megawatt hours in the average village, or 1.3 million kilowatt hours. So to put that in contrast, where I live here in Anchorage, our local grocery store, which is a Safeway store, uses about 2.7 million kilowatt hours in a year. So our average village is less than half the size of a grocery store in Anchorage. And Anchorage is not a particularly big community. When I go to a grocery store in some lower 48 communities, I mean, I'm just blown away. I walk around with my jaw hanging open because there's so much there. None of our communities have electric heat. They are all basically either heated with diesel fuel or with wood, because it's just not affordable to heat with electricity. If you take the relative, when you burn a gallon of fuel for electricity, you're only actually capturing about 1/3 of the BTU value of that gallon of fuel as electricity. The rest of it goes up in heat. And that heat is typically not recapturable and is not distributable in a small community because the loads are too small. So in addition to electricity, which is expensive in the communities need fuel for heat and transportation, which are very expensive. So a typical village, you're going to be paying $5 to $10 a gallon for gasoline and for heating fuel. Well, in Anchorage, gasoline is a little over $3 a gallon, so that doesn't sound like an awful lot more, but I would say that in 75% of our villages, the cost of gasoline and heating fuel is $6.50 to $8 a gallon, so that's a pretty expensive tab. And of course, our communities are non-cash. The actual cash disposable income is quite modest, and 40+% of our residents actually live below the poverty line, which when you have so much higher cost of energy, you can see that a very substantial chunk of the individual's income goes towards energy. There's a University of Alaska report that demonstrated that for about 20% of the population, up to 50% of their disposable cash income goes into energy. That's a pretty staggering number. So I mentioned power cost equalization a little while ago, and I'd like to just touch on that real briefly. It's a program that got started in 1984, and the reason it was started was because, as most of you know, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline was built and put into service in 1977, and oil started flowing down the pipeline. And by the early 80s, the state was taking in revenue beyond their wildest dreams. And so they began looking at mega solutions for all of Alaska for all of the basics. And electricity was a very significant chunk of that. And so several larger projects were put in the works for urban Alaska or communities with a high enough population that it was economically feasible to develop projects for them, hydro projects primarily, transmission lines, for example, to connect Fairbanks to the lower 48 so they could take advantage of actually subsidized natural gas that has been serving Anchorage since the 50s. So a huge study was commissioned, and that study essentially came up with, I'm sorry, there are just no solutions for rural Alaska because you have these small populations scattered across vast geographic areas with huge climatic issues, and there just are no solutions to serve them at a reasonable cost. So they recommended that this long-term subsidy be put in place, which is power cost equalization. And so that happened, and the program, as it was originally designed, was intended to reduce the cost of electricity for a basic amount of electricity for rural Alaska down to the average of what it cost in Anchorage, Fairbanks, and Juneau. Those were the urban centers. So back in '84, that was about 8.5 cents a kilowatt hour. And so that was the floor of the power cost equalization program. So no matter how much electricity you used or what it cost, you would always pay at least 8.5 cents a kilowatt hour for that electricity in rural Alaska. At that time, the average electric consumption in urban Alaska was about 800 kilowatt hours a month. And so they set the amount of electricity that could be used at 750 kilowatt hours. And it applied to basically all meters out in rural Alaska, including commercial users. In addition to serving the resident itself, they also established PCE on all community facility consumption. So if there was a building that was used for public purpose, a water and sewer facility, street lighting, community hall, all those sort of things, all of the electricity that they used was eligible for PCE. There was a limit though, and that limit was based upon how many residents were in that community. So it was 70 kilowatt hours per resident per month is the cap on how much can be used. As a practical matter, that cap is very rarely breached. Most communities use about 40 to 50% of what they can use for community facility PCE because they just don't have that many buildings that qualify to be considered a community facility. So it has been a huge boon for rural Alaska, but what I can tell you is that it has been whittled away over the years, and since then, today, the floor, for example, has gone from 8.5 cents up to 19 cents. So sadly, the average cost of power in Anchorage, Fairbanks, and Juneau is now 19 cents a kilowatt hour, which is about 50% higher than in the lower 48. Other constraints on the cost of the program resulted in reducing the amount of kilowatt hours that was eligible. So it's now 500 kilowatt hours for only 1 meter per person. So if you have 2 homes in 2 different villages, only one of those is eligible for PCE. And all commercial users were bumped off the program. And that, between all of these cuts, it's reduced the cost of the program by about 40% over the years. But it's still a very critical program for rural Alaska. So one of the things that we've done, more than 10 years ago, we essentially changed out all of our meters and put in smart meters in all of our 58 communities. But what that does is it gives us real-time information on what's happening at each location. We are notified when there is an outage at a location. We can query the meter to see what the voltage is and what the load is and if there's any anomalies at that particular spot. Eventually, all those smart meters are going to be linked together into a virtual SCADA system. SCADA is a system control, supervisory control, and of course, I forget the rest of it. Anyway, it's a sophisticated system to be able to determine exactly where the power is coming from, what it's doing, where the outages are at, why, what the loads are, how to reroute power, all of those things. And it's a pretty critical tool for us in the utility business. The meters are capable of two-way communication. So they talk to us and we talk to them. And what that means is that we can actually connect and disconnect those meters remotely. One of the things that we had huge issues with before we put in these meters was that we could only collect or disconnect meters for non-pay during a short period of the year because we actually had to send collectors. We sent contract collectors out to the villages to make arrangements to pay bills and collect bills. And so we had thousands of customers that would owe thousands of dollars because over the winter, we really didn't have the ability to enforce collection. And so we would have people run up huge bills and with all the resultant pain and misery when it came time to actually pay those bills. Now with these smart meters, we're able to disconnect from Anchorage, just push a button and the meter is offline and can be reconnected by pushing a button, as it were. So even though we try not to disconnect during the winter because of winter conditions, we will not disregard severely delinquent customers, and we will do winter disconnect when we have to. So we query all those meters at the end of the month, and they all send their meter reads in, and they can be automatically uploaded into our billing system. So in the past, before we had these meters, it would be a full week to 10 days before we could actually manually collect and enter meter reads and then issue bills. And now we do that in 2 to 3 days. So big difference in how that goes. Your bills are much more contemporaneous. As a practical matter, we have an excellent collection record. And this actually predates these smart meters. We've always had very high collections because in my opinion, rural Alaskans are loyal and they're honest and they're not going to take something that they're not entitled to. And so they pay their bills. Maybe not on time as we would like, but they pay their bills. So our collections are more than 99.5% of the total that we bill every month.
Meera, we have a question that just came in through Q&A here.
Cool.
The question is, do customers pay by mobile banking or do they send money some other way?
Well, actually, all of the above. We take credit cards. Customers can go online. We have online access through our website to customer accounts. They can monitor their bills online and they can pay online with credit cards or debit cards. We also have, I'm not sure if it's still the only, but we certainly had the first bank machine in Alaska when we installed one in Bethel, so that customers could come in at any time. Since our office was in the large grocery store in Bethel, the grocery store operated 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. And so customers could come in during that time, and we had a machine outside, a kiosk outside the office, where the customer could go in and they could enter their bill number. They could pay with a check, with cash, or with credit cards right there on the spot. So all of those options are available. What used to happen in the past, and still happens to a pretty large extent, is that customers will go to the post office and get a money order and mail us a money order. And if they're in dire straits and ready to be disconnected, they now use their cell phones and take a picture of that money order, and they text us the picture of that money order to show us that it's on its way. And that will stave the axe, as it were. Does that answer the question? Sounds like it.
I think so.
Okay, Van, here's another part of the solution, and that's wind. We have been installing wind generation in our communities since 2003. The first wind installation that we had was up here in Selwick. There were 4 66 kW AOC machines that actually have proven to be not very compatible. They were the only Arctic installation that was available to us at the time. Since then, we have installed some 30 additional machines across the state. You can see these green icons for wind turbines, and those icons, the size of the icons represents the relative size of the wind farm at that location. So for example, here on St. Lawrence Island, Savunga has 2 wind turbines and Gamble has 3 wind turbines. And so we tried to depict that in this. What this does not show is our 2 most recent installations. Those actually are just this year, 2019, will be their first full year of operation. But we have a 900 kilowatt EWT wind turbine in Bethel that started, that was commissioned late last year. And we have another one in St. Mary's, which is over here. And that was commissioned earlier this year. It's also a 900 kilowatt machine. And we are actually building a tie line between Mountain Village and St. Mary's. And that will be completed here very, very soon. And so power will be flowing from that wind turbine to Mountain Village as well. So we've got about, with these 2 newer wind turbines, about 5 megawatts of wind generation, which doesn't sound like a lot to somebody in the lower 48, but for us, it's a lot. That's probably 10% of our total installed generation capacity. And we've actually experienced some very high penetration levels. So, for example, in the community of Shaktoolik, we displace almost 40% of the diesel fuel that we would otherwise use for diesel generation with wind. So we're kind of on the cutting edge of high penetration wind, and we are actually developing a unique, what we call a grid bridge system, which is high capacity, quick response, tens of thousands of cycles capable through ultracapacitors. Now that also battery storage is becoming much more ubiquitous across the state and much less expensive, we're actively looking at putting in some conventional lithium ion or lithium titanate batteries in our system as well. So lots of exciting developments in that field. But as I said earlier, solar, not so much, because obviously we don't have a very good solar regime in Alaska. We have a good solar regime during the summer, but that's not when we have the loads. So how that's all going to mesh together in the long term remains to be seen. It's always an exciting mystery as to what's going to come next year and the year after. So that's what's happening in our renewables field. So how do we tackle the myriad challenges of rural Alaska? Obviously, the #1 goal is to maximize our efficiencies, and what that means is squeezing the most kilowatt hours possible out of a gallon of diesel fuel. So back in the early years, we're talking the mid-1970s, we sold about 6.25 kilowatt hours per gallon of diesel fuel consumed. Today, we're selling more than 14 kilowatt hours per gallon of diesel fuel used. And we actually are at a practical limit in terms of the functionality of diesel generators, because the generators that we use in the villages are very small. And as a result of that small size, there is just a limit to what can be done in terms of efficiencies. Now, when you go into the larger turbines, you know, the 3 and 4 and 5 megawatt diesel generators, and even 11 and 12 megawatts like they have in the valley today, you can generate 16 to 18 kilowatt hours per gallon of diesel. Those are numbers that we can just look at and gasp about, because those simply can't be achieved with today's technology out of diesel fuel for the smaller generators. So that has been a major target. We focus on that first. We focus also on reducing our line losses. So, again, going back 40 or 50 years, our line losses were 12 to 15% of, once you generated that electricity and pumped it out into the field, you could expect that you were going to lose 10 to 15% of the electricity that was generated was not going to be sold, because that's just the nature of the beast, the wiring and transformers and unmetered loads and so forth. Today, we are down to about 4.5%. So, and that's comparable with anywhere in the country, really, or anywhere in the world, and is to be expected just with wiring losses and transformation losses. We add communities when practical. We have in the past been not so discriminating about adding communities, and we have wound up adding a community because there was, some pressure from the board or from the communities at large to add small communities. And when you add a small community where you're selling only a few 100,000 kilowatt hours, and you have to operate a power plant there, you cannot generate enough non-fuel revenue to pay for the cost of operating that system. So as a practical matter, you wind up with all the other communities subsidizing the new communities. So we no longer will do that. If we are approached to add a community, we want to make sure that it's going to be able to more or less carry itself through the kilowatt hours that we sell locally. And as I said earlier, connecting communities is key. We do now only have 48 power plants, whereas 20 years ago, we would have had 58 power plants to serve 58 communities. So for each power plant that we're able to mothball or shut down, we figure we save about $150,000 a year in operating that power plant, or not operating that power plant. Just lube oil, generator overhauls, paying for power plant operators more than you would for a standby plant. So by putting in a standby plant, we reduce the cost of operating a regular plant by about 80%. So that's a huge plus. What it does is it allows us to stave off rate increases that would be necessary just because your cost of operation grow, just because of consumer price index changes and materials changes. So we continue to develop our technical resources. We have, for example, a wind superintendent whose primary goal is to optimize the production of our wind turbines. Because these wind turbines are so remote, when one goes down, it's hard to get it back out online again, because parts have to be flown in from distant areas. Technicians have to be flown in. You don't have cranes to be able to lift nacelles down. There's an awful lot of costs that we experience in rural Alaska that you don't experience in urban Alaska. Even though we buy a wind turbine and we're assured that you're going to have 95% availability, which means it's only down 5% of the year for routine technical operations and maintenance, that doesn't apply in rural Alaska. When a wind turbine goes down, it may not be available again for months or even years. Just because we had a wind turbine experience a problem in one of our communities in Tuxtla Bay, where essentially the hub that holds the rotors to the nacelle, the hub has a plate on the hub split. And so we had one of the rotors was actually hanging from that nacelle and not able, so the whole thing shut down. That wind turbine was down for a year and a half, and it cost over $750,000 to get it back up and running, because you had to get a crane in there, which means that you had to pay for a crane to be out of service for whoever the owner was for 6 or 8 months, and it had to get there, and then it had to stay the winter. So all of those things added together become extremely expensive, plus your availability goes into the ground, as it were. So those are challenges that we face, and we are now looking at alternative ways to develop wind generation. So, for example, collapsible towers, leaning towers, other things that negate the requirement for a 200-foot crane are all things that we now have on the drawing board and that are moving forward. So we developed those technical resources to be able to respond to our own problems. We're diversifying to the extent that we can. Remember that it has to be practical. We're not an R&D institution. We don't want model number one of anything because that's not in our community's interests. We continue to innovate our own solutions, and obviously our human resources, both in the field and at headquarters, are something that we laser focus on. One of the things that we've tried very hard to do is to actually develop expertise out in our villages. We look at every single power plant operator as a potential full-time employee of AVAC if we can get their skill sets and their interest levels up to the point where they want to do this as a full-time job. We actually have today 3 or 4 of our full-time traveling technicians are actually out of our villages, and we're extremely proud of them because it shows that we do have the capacity, the human capacity out in the communities to be able to form the base for a highly competent technical workforce. And we've developed partnerships over the years, very strong partnerships with NGOs as well as university systems and state and federal employee departments that work with us very closely. We know that if we can work together, we will develop a sustainable Alaska, and particularly a sustainable rural Alaska. It is such a challenge in the small community to become self-sufficient, and that is our ultimate goal, is that self-sufficiency.
We have a couple questions that just came in, Meera.
And I am on my last slide, so have at it.
Great. So real quick, someone asked about the webinar being available for those who dialed in late. It is being recorded and will be available via ACEP this week, our newsletter. So if you haven't signed up for the newsletter, again, you can go to our website, acep.uaf.edu, and scroll all the way to the bottom and enter your email address, and you'll find a link with this recording available in the next newsletter. So the first question comes from Eric Williams. He's asking, what challenges have there been surrounding energy storage?
So energy storage is very expensive. The installed cost of a kilowatt hour of storage has been extremely high. For our wind generation, what we wind up with is that in the average community where we have, say, 300 kilowatts of wind generation, for about 10% of their operating time, they are producing more electricity potentially than the community can absorb. And so we measure in terms of the total number of kilowatt hours and what their effective use may be as electricity as opposed to some other energy source. And what has been practical for us is to simply siphon off that excess power and use it as heat. So what we do, obviously, is we put in electrical boilers at a location like either the school or the water treatment plant, where they're going to be burning diesel fuel anyway for heat, and we displace that with wind-generated electricity. It's a small amount of electricity and has not been a major issue in terms of wanting to store it and reuse it as electricity as opposed to heat. More so today, because with the 2 larger wind turbines, the one in Bethel is not an issue because the average load in Bethel is about 2,500 kilowatts. And so a 900 kilowatt wind turbine, we're able to absorb all of the electricity into the system without having to divert any energy. But if we are to use all the energy possible out of the EWT in St. Mary's, about a third of its capacity is going to be surplus during times that it's operating. And of course, if we can store that and then use it for electricity at a later time in the day, that's great. But in order to store all that power for any length of time, you have to have such a large battery system that it just becomes overweight in terms of price and becomes not economically feasible. So that economic feasibility analysis that we do kind of kicks it out. On the other hand, the ultracapacitors that we're looking at and some version of another battery storage will allow us to have the many operations that we need, the tens of thousands of operations in the longer life, so that we're actually able to go diesels off for periods of time and be able to have just 90 seconds of backup storage in order for us to be able to bring a diesel back online. And so it's a matter of weighing what the practicality is of the instantaneous, the shorter term storage versus the longer term storage. But we're working with the University of Alaska, with ACEP, and also I'm trying to think if it's PNNL or INL, one of the national labs, on developing this grid bridge system. And we actually have one that where we are in the process of purchasing a system that we're going to be installing in St. Mary's probably within the year. So excited to see what that's going to bring for us. But yeah, we do not have conventional storage yet.
Eric, if that's a topic of interest for you, and you missed, if you missed Matt Bergen's presentation from KEA in Kotzebue, I highly recommend you check out that webinar recording. All right, we have another question from Heike Merkel, who asks, what's the max distance between villages that make a connection economical? How many of those do you have in your co-op?
So the longest distance connection that we have is the one that we're building right now between St. Mary's and Mountain Village, and that's about 22 miles. The challenge is that the cost of construction is very high, and a large part of that is because of anchoring the poles. We wind up having to pile drive, to pile support many of our poles in a tie line, just because all we have is permafrost and mush. And so depth makes it possible. When we built the tie line between Tuxwick Bay and Knifenute, that was a 17-mile tie line that we built in 2006, so 13 years ago. And that tie line cost us about $650,000 a mile to build. So what that really triggered for us was that we wanted to look into using direct current transmission as opposed to alternating current. The issue is, while the transmission is extremely practical and much lower cost than AC conventional transmission, the power conversion from AC to DC and vice versa is very expensive, and the transformers or converter stations don't exist for small loads, and we're talking about 500 kW, 1 megawatt loads at the end of those lines. And so we actually had worked with ACEP and with a consultant to develop a conceptual HVDC, or actually a low voltage DC conversion station of about 1 megawatt. That is not yet technically viable or economically viable, but we continue to hold out hope that DC transmission is going to become more viable, and then connections of 25, 30, 50 miles will be feasible. And you would be able to build those transmission lines instead of three-phase, which is essentially 3 conductors and a ground. you would be able to build it with 2 wires or potentially even just 1. Does that respond to the question?
I think so. Heike, feel free to follow up if you would like any clarification. The next question comes from Crystal Nelson. She asks, can you talk a little bit about ways that you innovate at ABEC?
Well, the grid bridge system that I talked about here momentarily is one of the things that we think is going to make a big difference in allowing higher penetration wind with an affordable storage interface. I would point to the tug and barge sets that ABEC had built, now 8 years ago. Those are the only 2 ATB barges. In other words, they are a tug and barge system where the barge locks into the tug, and as a result, you have much higher efficiency of transportation, and you can achieve much higher speeds, as it were, as much as 30 or 40% over conventional tow line tugs and barges, and so also allows you to maneuver in much tighter bends of the river, and so you can get to more places that you otherwise could not. So, that was new and untested on the market, and that's what we did. The smart meters that we installed, just in the last couple of years, we've been hearing lots about the smart metering system that the urban Alaska utilities are just installing with much fanfare. And what we put in 12 years ago is the same thing that they're doing today. So, we saw the value of moving forward with those systems and just did it. So we are much more amenable to innovation and moving forward with projects that are more cutting edge because we are a small cooperative. And so we have a board of directors who don't mind taking a little bit of risk and can move forward fairly easily. The larger utilities tend to get really bound up in the whole bureaucratic process. And so innovating is very hard for larger utilities. Whereas for us, we sit down together and go, what is the solution? Is there something out there? And between a small management staff, we can take leaps that are not otherwise practical.
So it looks like we have a follow-up question to the transmission lines, or the tie line that you were previously discussing. Factor E would like to know what the transmission voltage of the tie line that you were just talking about, the one that was $156,000 per mile.
$650,000 per mile.
Okay.
25 kV.
Okay. All right. Our next question comes from David Blockard, who asks, how many heat recovery systems does ABEC operate? Do you make money on them? Does the ABEC board value the heat provided?
Hi, David. Yes, we do have, I would say not in 100% of our communities, but 95%. I think there's 1 or 2 where we don't capture heat just because it doesn't do anything for us. But we capture heat in virtually all of our communities, and depending upon where the power plant is, depends upon whether we can share that heat with another user. For example, the school or the water treatment plant typically are the ones that we would look to. But when you have a very small community and the power plant is some distance, even a modest distance, 1,000 feet or a couple thousand feet from a user, you're using so little fuel that the potential for capturing and distributing heat is pretty modest. And so we use that heat for heating our own buildings. And typically we will not pump it elsewhere because it's not practical. But there are probably about 30 communities where we actually deliver heat to another entity. Most of those communities, I actually just saw a list yesterday of heat that was being billed to other users, and there are about 30 of them. Several of them, or more than one of them, are in one community. Typically, it's just one user or two users in a community that we actually sell heat to. And when we sell heat to them, we sell it for 30%, either 30% or 50% of what it would cost them to burn diesel for their own heat purposes. And we actually use our delivered cost of diesel to figure that, not theirs. So it's a very significant advantage for those entities that are using our heat. We do get revenue from the heat. Off last year, when I look at what we did last year, our gross revenue was about $52 million. And close to $1 million of that was from the sale of heat. One of the disadvantages of for a community where heat is being sold is that when our power cost equalization rate is being set by the Regulatory Commission of Alaska, they actually use all heat revenue as a deduction to the eligible costs for figuring PCE, and so the community gets hit with a lower PCE rate if heat is being sold in that community, otherwise, and that just to us is a terrible disservice to that community. So, for example, in the community of Bethel, where we have a large plant and we sell quite a bit of heat, and so the community of Bethel's PCE rate is about 2 cents lower than it otherwise would be were we not selling heat. So that's an anomaly that we keep trying to get the commission to change how they figure that, but it's still a work in progress. So yes, we do sell heat. We do get revenue from heat. I'm sure the follow-up question David's going to have is, do you capture exhaust heat? The answer to that is in 2 or 3 of our villages we do, where we have marine jackets, as it were, on the genset. That allows us to capture a big chunk of the exhaust heat. But otherwise, no, we don't have exhaust heat robbers, as it were, to inject into the heat, into the hot water to distribute in the community. It has, in the past, it's proven to be technically very complicated and not terribly practical. So I'd love to hear from David as to whether they're doing stack heat recovery in any of the AEA villages, if he wants to answer that.
David, I do have the capacity to give you voice if you would like to respond to that question in real time. Go ahead and give me an indication. You can use you can use the Q&A box. In the meantime, I'm going to move on to the next question. We have a question from Martin Miller. Do you have any specific battery projects in the works? If so, what size, capacity, and what time frame are you looking at?
The only one that's currently in the works is the grid bridge system that we're working on right now. It's a 500 kilowatt hour battery. We would be installing that in St. Mary's. We have just ordered a wind turbine for Stebbins, and that will serve Stebbins and St. Michael. That's a 900 kilowatt EWT wind turbine as well. And it is our intent to add a battery storage / grid bridge system there. And that'll probably be about the same as the one in St. Mary's, which will be about a 500 kilowatt hour, 500 kilowatt, probably a little more, maybe a 1,000 kilowatt hour storage system. And it might be ultra capacitors, and it might be a lithium titanate battery. So we don't know that yet, but that is in the works. And if that was to come to fruition, that would be next year. So one by the end of this year, we hope, and one next year.
Okay, it looks like David is happy to talk about heat recovery at AEA. So I'm going to go ahead and give him permission to talk. So, oh, it looks like you have an older version of Zoom. Here, I'm going to go ahead and promote you to a panelist. So,
Ooh, a promotion.
yes. David, why don't you go ahead and give it a try? We'll let you know if we can hear you. Okay, let's try one more time. David, can you speak for us?
Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Meera asked if we had had much success with stack robbers, and I think she's right on top of this technology. We have found that technically they work, but the maintenance and ongoing costs of operating those does not warrant the use of that technology. And what she mentioned, the marine manifolds are extremely successful all over the state. There may be an opportunity for AVEC to expand the use of those. I was recently in Holy Cross where they're installing a heat recovery system, and there would certainly be a benefit there to the use of marine manifolds. But I'm not saying I know that that's a good idea there. It just would be interesting to look at. So anyway, that was my response to Meera's question.
Cool. And do you know in the non-AVEC villages if there are any number of communities that are selling heat to other users in the community from their waste heat system?
Yes, it is. There's lots of heat recovery systems around the state. When we install a new powerhouse, we generally install a heat recovery system with a marine manifold, and we provide sample agreements for the sale of heat. You mentioned you charge 30 to 50% of the value. In my experience, many of those utilities charge 50 and maybe even as much as 70% of the value of the heat. It's an extremely valuable resource, fairly low tech. Some of the problems with it is it's with the older systems, it's hard to know if they're still working properly. But since you've already paid for the cost of the fuel that's providing the energy, and heat is the largest expense for energy in rural Alaska, we promote heat recovery wherever we can.
Great. Concur.
All right, thanks, David. I'm gonna boot you back to being an attendee.
Thank you.
All right, the next question comes from Crystal Nelson. She asks, with a high percentage of residents living below the poverty line in villages, how does AVEC afford renewable energy projects without raising the rates too high?
Oh, good question. First of all, we are very good at finding grants. We work very hard to try and offset the capital cost of that wind installation. It's obviously most installations you're going to have to pay some fairly significant chunk of change as your equity match for that project. What we do is we actually take all of our costs of operating wind systems, so that would be the depreciation and amortization of any component of that project cost that we absorb as our capital cost, cost of borrowed money, cost of operating the wind system, all of that. We collect those costs every year, and then we divide those costs out by the number of kilowatt hours that are sold over the entire system. And we then charge that back as a surcharge on the electric bill in the community that's getting the wind themselves for the exact number of kilowatt hours that are being sold in that community. So they pay for that cost of operating the wind systems, and then all of the benefits, which is the displaced fuel, stay in that community. So typically, What it works out to on average is there's a surcharge on the, so let's take Tooksuk Bay for example, just so we have a name. We would be charging them about a penny to a penny and a half per kilowatt hour for all the electricity sold in that community as a surcharge for wind. And their cost of, their fuel cost is reduced by about 6 or 7 cents a kilowatt hour because of the diesel that's being displaced by wind, if that makes sense to you. And so in the net benefit to them is about 5 cents a kilowatt hour for because they've got wind generation in the community. So it's a cost payer, but also the local community gets all the benefit. And so that way, the other communities that don't have wind in their communities are not paying for the costs of operating those wind systems. That's all being shouldered by those communities that have the wind systems in them. And the benefit also stays in that community. So it is a fair way to distribute those costs. At least in our opinion, it is.
All right, I'm going to give people a moment here if anyone has any further questions to get those in the Q&A box. Otherwise, just one more plug here. If you missed our first 2 webinars, they have been recorded and they will be available in our ACEP This Week newsletter. If you haven't signed up for that, you can do so by going to our website, acep.uaf.edu, and scrolling all the way to the bottom and entering your email address. Including this webinar, will be going out in the next newsletter. We have 2 more coming up, one from Chris Rose at REAP, and the final one from Gwen Holdman here at ACEP. She'll be talking about her work out at Chena Hot Springs and low temperature geothermal. If there are any topics that you are interested in learning more about, please indicate that in the survey that will pop up right after you exit this webinar. Let us know what you want to hear more about, what you want to learn about, what webinar topics you're interested in, and we will be planning our next round based on your feedback.
Carolyn, when are the next 2 webinars going to be happening? Chris's and Gwen's?
That is a great question. Let me pull up my calendar. Let's see. Chris Rose will be August. Let's see. I thought he was. I'm embarrassed that I don't know those off the top of my head, Meera. I apologize.
Didn't mean to stump you, but I'm sure it'll be in the newsletter, so that's okay.
Yeah, Chris Rose will be on August 22nd at 9 a.m. And Gwen's, we were trying to make them consistently kind of the same week of the month. Gwen Holdman will be September 26th. So August 22nd will be Chris Rose, and September 26th will be Gwen Holdman.
Great.
So I don't see any more questions coming in, but I do want to take a moment to thank you, Meera, for taking the time to participate in this webinar and the great discussion that followed.
Well, it was a lot of fun. I would love to do it again someday.
Well, great. So, oh, let's see, Crystal, can we reach out for more information to Meera?
You bet. I can give you my email address is mkohler, M-K-O-H-L-E-R, @avec.org, AVEC.org. And if you want to call, my desk line is 907-565-5531. And my cell phone, 907-952-6161. If you want to call my cell phone, I encourage you to text me so I know where and when, because sometimes that's not such a great idea. But anyway, yep, happy to make contact with and stay in touch with anybody that wants to do so.
Great. Well, Meera, thank you again for your time and all your hard work with AVEC. This was a great webinar, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. So keep an eye out for that survey that's coming up as we sign off, and let us know what you want to hear.
Thanks all. Thanks for calling in and giving me part of your day.
All right. Take care, everyone.